is a very special day, as today marks 1 year since I published The Charm. The Charm was an over year-long process that I worked on from the end of 2021, throughout 2022, and early 2023, where I then published it on March 8th, 2023. Even now in 2024, it still stands as my proudest and greatest accomplishment, given how much time I spent writing it. Therefore, I decided that to celebrate the 1 year anniversary of the Charm's publication, I thought that I would give a retrospective on it and provide my overall thoughts on the book, what I think went well, what I think went bad, and things I'd change if I wrote the book again. Enjoy the video. Now, how this video will work is that I'll start by talking about the Charm's backstory, where I'll first give a summary of the book, explain why I decided to give it the plot it has, and talk about why I chose to write it. Afterwards, I'll kind of turn this video into somewhat of a book review, where I'll explain the plot of the book and then talk about the things I feel like I did well with the book and the things I didn't do that well. When discussing the bad things, I'll also talk about what I could have done better with the particular issues at hand. Finally, I'll summarize my thoughts and even give my book a rating based on the objective goods and bads as well as my own opinions. Also, before I begin, there might be a few spoilers in this book. I'll try my best not to touch much on the ending because I don't want to spoil the book, but I can't guarantee that I won't be able to completely avoid discussing the ending since I do have some thoughts about it. So just be mindful about it. When we get to a spoiler section, I'll stop talking about the book and remind you that we're about to talk about a spoiler section, and then I'll provide a timestamp in the description so you can skip over it. Alright, so The Charm is a coming-of-age book written by me that follows the second half of my 8th grade school year. The main character book is 13-year-old me, and throughout the book, I suffer through a multitude of issues such as bullying, teasing, loneliness, hard classes, and many others, all of which contributed to me developing mental health issues throughout the book. The book is based on my actual 8th grade school year, the hardest school year of my life and a school year that continues to traumatize me even 6 years later. As for what made me start writing this book, we'll need to go back to December 10th, 2021. This is a very special day for me, as it was my last day of high school. Since I was very successful throughout my time in high school and made good course selections, I was able to graduate a semester early and start college earlier than everyone. Anyways, I bring this up because around lunchtime, I visited my 9th grade English teacher's classroom. My 9th grade English teacher, who I had for English for both 9th and 11th grades, was one of the most influential teachers I've ever had. She played a big role in encouraging me to be successful in high school, and was always a big supporter of my writing, which I was pretty well known for throughout the school force since everyone really enjoyed story time. Now, when I visited her classroom, the one thing I really wanted to show her was a project I did for her class back in 11th grade where I had to write a short book written in the format of The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, the book we were reading at the time in class. My book was called Shark in the Water, a short 5-chapter book based on my experiences swimming and dealing with my swim coach from when I used to swim. It was an incredibly well-written book and stands to this day as the greatest project I think I've ever done in my whole academic career, as I voluntarily invested a lot of time into the project and took a lot of inspiration from Storytime 19, which also manages to hold up as one of my best story times even 3 years later. So that's what I did. I showed her the project and we talked a little bit about it. She made some comments about it. Until then, she challenged me to do something that I was a little uneasy about: write and publish a full-fledged novel. Despite being skeptical about it, I decided that I would take up her challenge. That night after getting home, I spent some time planning my ideas, deciding what to write about, and brainstorming chapters that I would include in the book. This would mark the beginning of an over year-long process of writing a full-fledged novel. Now, writing The Charm, as you might expect, was not easy at all. On top of being a long book, I wrote it during my first 2 semesters of college and during one of my worst years mentally, 2022. 2022 was a rough year for me mentally, especially as I started college and found myself alone in a different environment than what I was used to for the past few years. I was also desperate for a girlfriend, often chasing every girl I fell in love with. Thankfully, I got used to college and also stopped chasing girls a year later, and since then, I've been very mentally stable and I've been able to focus on myself more. I've also since begun to appreciate being single and being satisfied with myself, but nonetheless, 2022 was definitely not my best year mentally. So on top of dealing with bad mental health and taking college courses, you can see why writing The Charm was such a difficult process on top of just writing it in general. But I ultimately pulled through, and after much hard work and dedication, I wrote the last chapter on December 30th. Then after a couple months of editing, I published The Charm on March 8th, 2023 to celebrate 5 years of me being self-harm free, and to mark 5 years since I tried to take my own life. So that's a little bit of the history of how I pulled through and wrote the book. But now that it's been out for an entire year, I thought that I would reflect on it and give my overall thoughts on it. To start, let's talk about the plot of The Charm. So the book starts off with me having a dream about me walking through my neighborhood and spotting a cave. I went into the cave only to be ambushed by a black demonic figure with a bloody smile, who I called the demonic figure. The demonic figure would haunt me in my sleep for the next 2 months, where he would perform multiple gruesome and horrifying acts of violence that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to discuss on YouTube. By the way, I'm gonna avoid talking about the particularly gruesome and barbaric things that happen in the book, as well as avoid swearing entirely in this video since I want to keep this video professional. Anyways, the demonic figure was actually based on a real nightmare I had where I was in a cave and all of a sudden, this evil bloody grin was all that I could see. Pretty much exactly how this first chapter goes. Throughout the book, I would have a vast multitude of nightmares, almost all of them involving the demonic figure. Anyways, the next few chapters follows my first day of school, back from Christmas break. In these chapters, we're introduced to Justin, the main antagonist of the book, who I based on all the bullies and cyberbullies who drove me to my mental limits back in 8th grade. We're also introduced to my teachers too in my classes. But then in chapter 7, we're introduced to probably the most important character in the whole book, Leslie. Leslie, a 12-year-old 7th grader whom I named after the love interest from Bridge to Terabithia, is a new student I share art with. Originally from Northern Virginia, she's extremely scared about moving down to North Carolina and being in a different environment, so our art teacher assigns her to sit with me, where I originally was sitting alone. She then introduces herself to me and very quickly, we become best of friends. This is a big deal for me, as in this book, Leslie is the first friend I've ever made in my entire life. Of course, in real life, this wasn't the case, as I made my first friend in 4th grade, but I wanted to bring up the problems that we autistic people have with making friends. By the way, even though I never brought it up in the book, I intended Leslie to also be autistic. But I think she makes it very clear that she's on the spectrum throughout the book anyways, so I don't think it's too big of an issue. However, you'll come to find that I have a huge issue with Leslie's introduction. I'll talk more about it when I discuss the charm's flaws, as it was probably the biggest flaw in the whole book, especially since Leslie is hands down the best character in the book. Anyways, back to discussing Leslie's personality, she unfortunately has to deal with the same issues as me, as when she moves down, she's bullied by a popular girl named Riley and her friends. This would be absolutely detrimental to Leslie's mental health, as later in the book, she would begin harming herself. Eventually, her mental health would deteriorate so much that she would commit suicide, which interestingly is the only death in the entire book despite how violent the charm is. I'll touch more on that later. But for the time being, she was my best friend. We also happened to sit very close to each other on the bus, and after she stood up for me against Justin, he wouldn't mess with us on the bus. So every day in art, we would we would just talk and then walk each other to the bus. I also want to mention that by far the most important feature of Leslie is her gold unicorn necklace. She wears this thing around and is often referred to as a charm, which of course ties into the book's name. Well, not exactly, as the book's name is actually an anagram that I'll discuss later. Then we're introduced to my swim club. The swimming chapters took direct inspiration from Shark in the Water and Storytime 19, where my swim coach, Coach Steven, is a super mean coach who claims that we should treat swimming more seriously than even school, similarly to how my actual coach said. Throughout the book, he has me not only do ridiculous sets and practices, but he forces me to swim obnoxious events and meets like the 200 butterfly, 400 IM, and 200 backstroke. Once that's finished, that pretty much wraps up the introductory phase of the book. Chapters 16 to 75 are what I consider the middle portion of the book, which was by far the best part of the book. This section is jam-packed with events, violence, and a very interesting plot that keeps readers on their feet throughout each chapter. However, these chapters also, as you can expect, get extremely dark. Take chapters 36 through 43 as an example. These 9 chapters are all about Leslie's suicide. Unfortunately, the pain and suffering that Leslie receives from Riley is too great. And on top of having similar nightmares to me and even developing romantic feelings for me, she feels that she can no longer continue living. So in these chapters, Leslie's death is described in detail in the aftermath of it. Chapter 37 in particular is extremely beautifully written, where I perfectly described her last few minutes, the writing of her suicide note, and the moment she hangs herself. It's in my opinion the most emotional chapter in the book, so emotional that I even shed a few tears writing it. Then in chapter 39, I attend Leslie's funeral. Her parents take me to their home and we look over her bedroom. Her father then gives me her necklace, which I would go on to call the charm. I would wear it myself from then until the darkest chapter, which I'll get to then. However, wearing it wasn't the only thing I did with it, as after Leslie's suicide, I would go on to become suicidal myself and start harming myself, which I would often do with Leslie's charm. From then until chapter 75, that's a common theme, harming myself. I continually stab myself with her charm, get bullied badly by Justin, Riley, and their friends, get crammed with schoolwork, get sent death threats online by strangers, have extremely vulgar nightmares, and just become worse and worse mentally until we of course reach chapter 75, which I like to call the darkest chapter. The darkest chapter is directly based on March 8th, 2018, the day I attempted suicide. In real life, my suicide attempt didn't get that far, as I only managed to stab my left hand and part of my chest until my science teacher discovered what was up and was able to get me the help I needed. To this day, I'm still fully indebted to her for saving my life and will forever be for the rest of my life. However, in the charm, it's a lot more bloody, as I bring a full-fledged knife to school and in the middle of science class, I stab myself with it in the bathroom until I reach the verge of death. However, I ended up leaving my suicide note in class, so when my teacher looks at it, she's absolutely horrified and comes into the bathroom to see me almost dead, where she screams and panics and I proceed to take Leslie's charm, which was beside me, and stab myself once more, knocking me completely unconscious and making the words of the demonic figure from chapter 1 come true, which were, "Your fate will be the charm." The rest of the darkest chapter is just my teachers and parents freaking out, the school being put on lockdown, me being transferred to the hospital, and my parents being told that I would be unlikely to survive. However, the next chapter follows the last nightmare chapter in the book, just that rather than me having it, my science teacher has it. She basically dreams that she's in a bathtub when all of a sudden, she bleeds a ton. That's when the demonic figure appears and tries to kill her, where she wakes up before she of course is slain. She then gets a call from my mom, who tells her that I am miraculously alive. The next chapter follows my initial moments after waking up from my suicide attempt, gaining back my consciousness, and my parents, sister, and teachers being relieved that I'm alive. The rest of the book, which I'm not going to talk about much because of course spoilers, is about me recovering from my suicide attempt and my new life as a completely different person, which is exactly what happened when I actually did try to kill myself, as I became a completely different person after the incident. So that's kind of an overview of the plot of the book. Of course, the book is way bigger than just that summary, as it's actually over 134,000 words long, which is about 30,000 words shorter than Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. But I think that's a pretty good synopsis of the book. Now, the next couple of the parts of this video will be a lot longer, as I'll be critically examining the book and talking about what I think went right, what went wrong, and some things I feel like I could change if I wrote the book again. We'll start with what I really liked about the charm. These aren't going to be in any particular order, so as I'm just going to simply talk about some things worth mentioning that I feel were great things about the book. The first thing I'll talk about is the title. While the charm might not be a very significant title at first, it becomes a pretty clever one when you decipher it as an anagram. By doing this, you get March F, the day, or March F, or just March 8th, the day the darkest chapter takes place. That's why I also decided to have Leslie wear one and use it as a symbol, so it could kind of play along with the title. I still applaud myself for this title to this day, as it was probably the best title I could have ever come up with. The second thing I want to talk about is just Leslie in general. In my 7 years of writing, I have never written a character as amazing as Leslie. Leslie was a phenomenal character to write, and was all around a super lovable character. Like, I genuinely cannot fathom a single reason to not like Leslie, as she's a sweet, adorable, and nice young girl who gets bullied by a group of evil fiends. That's how I intended her to be, since I wanted to make her suicide all the more tragic. Speaking of which, chapter 37, which goes over Leslie's final moments on Earth, is probably the most well-written chapter in the entire book. I perfectly emasculate the sadness, despair, and depression that's going through Leslie and make her suicide an absolute tragedy. In fact, I'll just read y'all the last page of the chapter because it's just so beautifully written and just tragic at the same time. After writing her note, Leslie folded the note and placed it on her bed frame. Time to make the world a better place, she thought as she got a stool and placed the noose around her neck. 3, 2, 1, she counted down. After counting to 1, Leslie Patterson jumped off the stool, where she shut her eyes for the final time. I remember the exact moment I was writing this chapter. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and I was tearing up quite a bit. Leslie's suicide, despite being fiction, was truly a tragedy, even for me as the author. And look, I know that I could have just had her survive and all this would have been forgotten, but I felt that if I did, I would be softening suicide and making it something that's small when in reality, suicide is an incredibly sad and extremely concerning problem, especially for me as someone who not only lost himself to it, but also lost one of his best friends to it. I wanted to describe just how awful it is to lose someone to it and why it's such an awful thing to have to go through, especially with it being someone as pure-hearted as Leslie, and I think I did so incredibly well. A third thing I want to applaud myself for is my character development throughout the book. As my mental health grows worse and worse throughout the book, you start to really see my growth as I get through situation after situation. My character development especially shines after the darkest chapter, which I'll go ahead and warn y'all that we're about to hit a spoiler section. I'll give y'all 3 seconds to skip this timestamp. Alright, so when it comes to my character development, I feel that this is especially seen once Lydia, Freddy, and Devante are introduced. The 3 of them, of course, visited me while in the hospital, and as you can expect, this greatly improved my mental health and overall stability because I finally had friends again. The 3 of them, throughout the rest of the book, continued to encourage me and help me grow as a person, with me at some points even speaking clearly and sincerely, and in the epilogue, 17-year-old me is able to say a speech in front of my high school as I graduate. But I'd say probably the biggest piece of character development comes from my dream chapters with Leslie. Throughout these chapters, Leslie's spirit aids me and motivates me to get better and even tells me to break her charm in chapter 78. I'd pull this through in chapter 97, which is probably my favorite chapter in the book, just because of how satisfying it is for me to destroy the same object that almost killed me the week before. And in the chapter following it, I of course meet Leslie again in my sleep, where we see the fate of the demonic figure, which was a very satisfying chapter to write and will always be a super satisfying chapter to read too. But my character development in these chapters is just insane, especially as I overcome depression and become someone I want to be. Alright, spoilers are over, let's talk about another thing I liked about the charm, that being the foreshadowing. So I did a really good job with the foreshadowing in this book, where I used nightmare chapters to aid me in it. Probably the most notable piece of foreshadowing of the book was the darkest chapter being foreshadowed all the way back in chapter 1, when the demonic figure says that my fate will be the charm. Throughout the rest of the book, the charm is used as a symbol of demise and hate, until of course the darkest chapter comes and I actually almost die from stabbing myself with it. I like this because it keeps a consistent theme throughout the book, and keeps readers on the edge as they wait for the statement to be satisfied. There's also the second nightmare chapter where I dreamed that Leslie killed herself, only for that nightmare to literally come true later in the book. It was also a good way to foreshadow her death and even made it all the more scarier. Another thing I did well was comedic relief chapters. So when I write something as vulgar or as dark as the charm, I tend to get tired of my writings being super violent and need a comedic break. So from time to time, I wrote a multitude of more humorous chapters that break away from the book's normal dark environment. While initially you might think that these chapters don't fit well with the rest of the book, they actually fit perfectly, with me often tying these chapters to the rest of the book and still keeping them relevant. I took inspiration for the comedic relief chapters from a multitude of William Shakespeare plays, where a particular dark or tragic scene would be followed by a more humorous scene as seen in plays like Macbeth and Julius Caesar. Probably my favorite of these chapters was chapter 49. In this chapter, a food fight breaks out during lunch and the cafeteria becomes an absolute madhouse. Food fight stories never get old, and while I unfortunately never got to experience one back when I was in school, I still love hearing about these stories and how chaotic they are. So you can understand why I had an absolute blast writing this chapter, as it was definitely a nice break from what I was used to writing. I'd even promised myself to write a food fight chapter in every future book I write, just because of how much I love food fight stories. Chapter 14 is also one of the more funnier comedic relief chapters. In it, we're in science class doing experiments regarding mixtures. However, when we get to the last part of the experiment, our teacher gives us some advice regarding what to do for the last one. But Justin, being the idiot that he is, disregards our teacher's advice and goes ahead, only for the mixture to blow up all over him. At this point, he was completely covered in a white gooey liquid, and of course being middle schoolers, you can kinda guess what some people associated this with. All around, it was a pretty funny chapter and a nice break from all the chaos that happens in the book. Chapter 45 was also a great comedic relief chapter, especially after all the stuff that happened a few days prior with Leslie's death. In this chapter, Riley tries to make fun of me, only for the bus to take a super sharp turn and for a tree branch to go right through her window. To make things even better, I laugh when this happens while one of Riley's friends tell me it's not funny. I gave the classic "did I ask" response, and then she said that I had no idea how it felt to be made fun of, which is very ironic since I had been being made fun of by Riley, Justin, and everyone else on the bus. And if this friend of Riley's wasn't stupid enough, in future chapters, she would make fun of me alongside Riley and Justin, just proving how dumb she was. There was also quite a lot of comedic relief stuff in the 30 chapters following the darkest chapter, meaning we'll be hitting another spoiler section. Again, you can click on the timestamp in the description if you want to avoid spoilers. Anyways, with that said, there were a lot of funny moments in the later chapters, especially with my friends. Devante in particular was a fun character to write, especially the card he sent me in chapter 81, which still cracks me up every time I read it. The lack of capitalization, apostrophes, and basic writing techniques in the card just made it all the more silly, especially when you compare it to cards written by Freddie and Lydia, both of which were a lot more professionally written. I designed Devante to be more of a comedic relief character, and I think I did a good job in achieving that while still making him a lovable character. Comedic relief characters tend to be a big issue in a lot of pieces of literature, and especially in anime. Like most comedic relief characters are usually just annoying, don't contribute to the plot, and are just bad characters whose presence makes the show not as good. Mineta from My Hero Academia is a good example of an awful comedic relief character, as he's a crybaby pervert who isn't even funny. If he was cut from the show would literally be better. But thankfully, I made Devante a way better character than Mineta, and as I made him an actually funny and important character in the later chapters of the book. Alright, so spoilers are done, let's move on and talk about the next thing I want to bring up that I thought was really cool. That being me and Leslie having the same dreams. I thought this was cool because when two people have the same dream, it usually implies emotional closeness and that the two parties are very close with one another. And of course, the first third of the book involves me and Leslie becoming very close and being best friends. So for us to have the same nightmares is a sign that we are very close. Figured I brought this up just because I thought it was cool for us to dream the same nightmares, while suffering the same issues in our waking lives. Now, the next few good things about the charm that I'll be discussing are more chapter specifics that I thought were kind of cool. One instance is chapter 67. This is a nightmare chapter where I found myself at a beach called the Bad Beach. Here, a little girl was playing until she noticed me and Leslie, who found herself on the beach too. This girl then proceeded to eat both of us, with me waking up before she manages to eat me. Now, at first, this might seem just like any nightmare chapter. However, what's so cool about it is that it's actually based on one of the earliest nightmares I've ever had, as I dreamed this nightmare way back in 2011 when I was just 7 years old. Basically, I found myself at a beach at night called the Bad Beach. I don't remember too many things that happened, but I remember watching a turtle lay eggs inside of a boy's swimsuit, and then I got absolutely pounded by waves, which was what woke me up from the nightmare. Not the scariest nightmare per se, but for 7-year-old me, this is a terrifying dream and has stuck with me even now as an adult. As for why I included that crazy girl in the nightmare, I actually based her off a girl that I met at a hotel pool. So when I had the Bad Beach nightmare, I was actually away on a weekend trip in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. The night before going to bed, I was playing in the hotel pool when I ran into this girl who was about a year or two younger than me. Not sure how it started, but the main thing I remember was that she wore these false teeth that allowed her to make a dinosaur roar, and they would glow up when she roared. For the next 30 minutes, she would absolutely terrify me and chase me around in the pool while roaring. Even almost 13 years later, I still get scared just thinking about her. So I figured that I would create a character based off her in the book to make the chapter a little more scary. Another chapter specific thing I want to comment on is just the darkest chapter itself, because wow was this chapter an absolute roller coaster to plan and write. Overall, I think I did fantastic discussing it. Again, this chapter is an extreme over-exaggeration of what actually happened, but the whole book itself is the same way, as all the events are very over-exaggerated in order to convey the message that mental health is a serious and important topic. But going back to the darkest chapter, I think I did a fantastic job conveying the seriousness of mental health, especially suicide, as the chapter is an extremely intense and chaotic chapter that provides an overview of my very worst moment. However, I do want to address an issue with this chapter that while I can understand being an issue, I personally don't think it is because of how I structured the book. So a big issue that some people might have with this chapter is that despite the book being written in first person, I continue to talk about what's going on after I knock myself unconscious, which can be confusing for readers because I'm the narrator talking about my own death, as I'm considered to be dead after I stab myself with Leslie's charm for the last time. However, As I discussed in the meaning and analysis, the me that's here making this video and the me from the charm are actually two different people. I like to think of the charm as being a separate dimension where things worked out differently than they did in real life. This, therefore, allows me to flip-flop between first and third person, which I did throughout multiple chapters, most notably the chapter Leslie kills herself. This technique, which I call perspective shifting, took lots of time to get used to because I'm so used to writing exclusively in first person. However, as I continued to write the charm, I think I got better and better at perspective shifting, which is why I was able to do it very well in the darkest chapter after I knocked myself unconscious, and my teachers are freaking out over my suicide. That's why I don't think this is as much of an issue as perhaps others might think it is. One last chapter specific thing I figured that I discuss takes us back to chapter 10. This is the chapter where Coach Steven was introduced and where I talk about all the ridiculous things he had us do. The chapter itself isn't really significant, except for the last sentence of the chapter, where I call him a shark in the water. This is a reference to the book I wrote for that 11th grade English project I showed my teacher before she challenged me to write the charm, where I also called my swim coach in that book a shark in the water, which refers to a very rude and inconsiderate person, to which my coach was. However, even cooler than this, I took this phrase to its absolute limits in chapter 13. In this nightmare chapter, I find myself back at a swim meet, where I'm at the blocks about to swim an interesting event called the Charm. Obviously, that's not an event in swimming, so of course I'm confused. However, Coach Steven appears behind me, where he turns into a literal shark and chases me and the other swimmers. The chapter ends right before he eats me. But what's so cool about this chapter is that I called Coach Steven a shark in the water in chapter 10, and in here, he literally becomes a shark in the water. I thought this was such a creative and innovative way to use this phrase, as I really wish I made more nightmare chapters like this because this was a really cool idea. So that's all the good things about the charm that I wanted to discuss. The next few things I'll be talking about are things that I either did not do a good job of, or just things that downright suck about the book. This section will be much shorter than the good things because while I tried to be as critical and nitpicky as possible, I couldn't find many issues with the book because I genuinely did a fantastic job writing it. But there are a few flaws with the book that I do want to address, so I figured I would bring them up here. By far the biggest issue with the whole book has got to be Leslie's introduction, because wow was this part so unrealistic and just downright rushed. Me and Leslie initially meet in art in chapter 7, where our teacher introduces her to a class and has her sit beside me since I was sitting at a table by myself. Initially, I don't pay much attention to her, but she talks to me and very quickly, we become super close. It then gets to the point where she talks about how growing up in Virginia, where she immediately becomes teary and cries. I then comfort her by hugging her and even start crying myself. Now, the main reason that this introduction was bad was because it happened very suddenly, where there wasn't much explanation to the build-up. To help you understand, I'll use the beginning of ReZero, my favorite anime, as an example. At the beginning of the show, the main character, Subaru, is shopping at a convenience store when all of a sudden, he's randomly teleported into a different world. Besides the fact that ReZero is an isekai anime, an anime where the main character is teleported to a new world, an explanation isn't really given as to why Subaru is forced into this world. In most other isekais, the main character often dies to be teleported into their new world. Some other isekais, such as Sword Art Online, take a different approach where the main character doesn't die, but they enter a new world with at least an explanation, such as Kirito putting on the Nerf gear and entering virtual reality, only for it to be revealed that players cannot leave. However, ReZero fails to explain why Subaru ended up in the alternate world, which is why only reason I gave it a rating of 9.7 rather than a 10, despite being my favorite anime ever. And unfortunately, I made the same mistake in the charm, as I failed to provide a reason as to why me and Leslie grew close so quickly or why I practically turned off my blunt and dense personality the moment I met Leslie despite never even making a single friend before. However, I think it all boils down to me just downright rushing the introduction in order to make room for Leslie's moments. When I brainstormed Leslie, the first thing I brainstormed, as morbid as it might sound, was her death. I intended her to commit suicide and make that be the main reason for me to develop suicidal thoughts in the book. By doing this, I knew that I would need to make us two very close and create fond memories with each other, so I rushed her introduction to make more room for our moments together. While not a bad reason for rushing, I think had I spread out her introduction from our first meeting until her death, not only could I have introduced her better, but I also could have provided her with even more character development than she already has. This would have made her an even better character, which again, says a lot since she is the best and most well-written character in the book. Another flaw I want to point out in the charm are Leslie's parents. So Leslie's parents are very minor characters, only appearing in the chapters directly following Leslie's suicide. Of course, they still play a role in the book, with her father being the one to bestow me with Leslie's charm, which is a very important part of the book since that's literally what I kill myself with in the darkest chapter. However, I wish that I made them more significant characters, especially being the parents of my best and only friend. I wouldn't have to put them in every chapter or even that much in the book, just at least reintroducing them. A good place to reintroduce them would have been the chapters following the darkest chapter. We're about to hit another spoiler section, so feel free to skip to the timestamp in the description if you do not want to hear the spoiler. I'll give y'all 3 seconds to do so. Alright, so what I wish I did was have Leslie's parents visit me while in both the emergency room and mental hospital. Perhaps I could have had them visit me the chapter I had the dream where Leslie told me to destroy her necklace, where I then talk it over with them and they tell me to do so. I could have had them come visit me again in the mental hospital to talk about Riley specifically, who of course was the girl that drove their daughter to suicide. I also could have incorporated them into the ending. Given their religious background, I think it would have been cool that they also attended Lydia's church and then have them witness me giving my life to Christ, and then maybe even having Leslie's father be the one who baptizes me. Then in the epilogue, when I'm graduating from early college, I could have invited them as I did with Freddie, Lydia, and Devante, and maybe had me reference Leslie in my speech. Speaking of my friends, I think that I could have also made it so that Freddie, Lydia, and Devante were close with them and comforting them, further connecting the characters and making Leslie's parents more significant. I'm not sure how I would do this, but I could definitely see it being done and it would have allowed for more interesting chapters. Alright, spoiler sections are done, so now let's talk about another flaw, being the nightmare chapters in general. Now, I don't think the nightmare chapters in of themselves are bad. In fact, I've already praised some nightmare chapters like chapter 1 and chapter 13. However, I think that while most nightmare chapters are interesting and scary, they don't have much relevance or purpose to the book other than to be violent. Nightmare chapters tested my limits and how vulgar I could write, and I did a good job of doing that by writing extremely graphic and diabolical chapters involving people dying in some of the most barbaric and downright disgusting ways ever. However, in terms of how relevant they are to my waking life, they aren't really that related. Some chapters aren't like this, as they do a good job of foreshadowing, as in the case for Chapter 1 and Chapter 74, while Chapter 13 takes a figure of speech and turns it literal. But the other chapters, while mostly based on actual nightmares I've had as a result of trauma from my suicide attempt, are not very relevant to the book and are just there to be there. I think I could have fixed this by making each chapter have a hidden meaning or incorporate something from the chapter before it. I did this for Chapter 22, where the chapter before, me and Leslie come across a Black Widow and I kill it with my shoe. In this nightmare, I do that again, only for the Black Widow to revive and become large, and then it eats us both. I wish the other nightmares did something like this more often, since it tied in directly to the book and puts an interesting spin on what happened in my waking life. Another issue I have with the book deals with the sets that Coach Steven had me swimming. So throughout the book during practice, Coach Steven would force me to do some really crazy sets that not even Olympians would do, like 800 IMs, 400 butterflies, and other crazy things. While I can 100% do these events, as hard as they would be, that's not my issue. My issue is the fact that my ability fluctuates throughout the book. Like at every swim meet, I'm placed in the 200 butterfly, which I complain about all the time. I'm also often placed in the 400 IM and 200 backstroke, both of which I also complain about. But I feel that I make them sound worse than the things Coach Steven has me do at practice, which kinda takes away consistency from the book. And the worst part is that the issue has a super easy fix as well, that being having Coach Steven give me lighter but still tough sets in practice. That way, my complaints about swimming 400 IMs or 200 butterflies won't feel as shallow since I was already swimming 800 IMs in practices. Finally, to wrap up my issues with the charm, I wanted to talk about some contradictions I made throughout the book. So being an almost 800-page book, you can kind of understand why there might be a multitude of contradictions and mistakes in the book, as it's almost impossible to write a book of that length and not make mistakes. And while I did good for the most part avoiding these, there were a few that I wanted to bring up. One such instance would be Chapter 16, a nightmare chapter where I consider to be when nightmare chapters start to get super vulgar. Anyways, this chapter involves a clown feeding me meat, only to reveal that it's actually meat coming from young boys. However, the contradiction comes when he reveals that he kidnapped Leslie, where he then proceeds to turn her into meat despite Leslie being a young girl. Even though this is a more minor contradiction that's easy to miss given how vulgar the chapter is, it still is there, and I think had I just made him say young kids or something like that, I could have easily fixed the issue. Another contradiction I made that's even more minor than chapter 16 was chapter 23. A few chapters before, I had a meet where I skipped the 200 butterfly. However, in this chapter, I say that I missed the 100 butterfly. This is actually more of a typo since later in the chapter, Coach Stevens says I missed the 200, but I still wanted to bring it up since I somehow missed it during the editing phase of the book, where I reread the book twice and completely overhauled some chapters. But probably the biggest contradiction I made in the book has got to be Justin's reason for bullying me. In chapter 2, I say that Justin bullied me because he viewed people like me as waste of space and made the school look bad. But then in the rest of the book, I say that I don't know why he bullies me, although I still often blame my vulnerability for it. To be fair, this isn't that bad of an explanation, especially given that Justin thinking of me as a waste of space is a very vague reason for me bullying, which is what I wanted since even 6 years later, I still don't know why the bullies back in 8th grade treated me the way they did. However, I think that had I just simply said that I didn't know why he bullied me, that would have maintained consistency. So those are some things that I could have done better with the charm. Not a whole lot to mention since the book was for the most part well written, but I figured I'd bring up a few issues that I can now spot a year after publishing. So with all that said, now it's time to give my honest and overall opinion about the charm. Overall, I think I did a great job writing it. While the book takes a little bit of time to get into, once it picks up, it becomes a really enjoyable and interesting book to read. I had two goals when I wrote The Charm, which were to satisfy my 9th grade English teacher's challenge as well as bring awareness to mental health and show why mental health should be taken seriously. And I feel like that I satisfied both challenges very well. The book does a great job exploring mental health issues as well as mental disabilities like autism, and overall, I think I did fantastic with this book. Therefore, I will give the book a rating of 9.3 out of 10. The book loses points for the problems mentioned earlier in the video, but all around, the book is absolutely fantastic and still stands to this day as my proudest accomplishment, especially to have started work on it at only 17 years old and then published it at 18 years old. For reference, the average age of an author upon publishing their first book is 42, which says a lot given how I was barely an adult when I published Charm. So with all that said, what next? Well, about a month after publishing The Charm, I announced a new book that I would be working on called Childhood's End. I'd start work on it that November and make steady progress until January of 2024, where I wrote a chapter more disturbing than all The Charm. The chapter ended up causing me to throw up twice writing it, and because of it, I decided to drop it. However, that isn't to say that I've given up writing books, as earlier this week, I started work on my next book called Unworthy. This is a book about a 13-year-old autistic girl named Rika, who gets bullied by popular kids at her school, attends an abusive church similar to the one I attended as a teen, and develops a multitude of mental health issues. While I feel that I have great plans for it, my main concern is that it will be too similar to The Charm, but I will use many different techniques and plot twists in order to differentiate it. So hopefully, it too will be just as much of a masterpiece as The Charm was. So with that, that wraps up this video. Thank you all for 1 year of The Charm, reading it, enjoying it, and encouraging me. I had a blast writing The Charm, and I had a blast reflecting it on this video. Thank you all, and I'll see you all later. Bye!